Well, for more on Canada's legalization of cannabis, I'm joined by Sanho Tree. He is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and director of the Institute's Drug Policy Project. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So let's start with why Canada's decision is considered so noteworthy.
This is the largest industrialized nation to legalize cannabis on a national scale. So Uruguay was the only other country to have done that fully. The Dutch and others have decriminalized or tolerated marijuana sales, but it's not technically legal. It's the lowest level of law enforcement priority. So by legalizing it, you're able to regulate the market, which is a big improvement over the past because you could not regulate an economy, a very lucrative economy, which you deliberately drove underground. And so organized crime or actors outside of the law were the ones regulating that market. And again, as you mentioned, when you have a legal market, it undercuts the black market because people want to see their cannabis that's been tested. What we found out in Colorado's legalization in 2012, for instance, is that a lot of dealers, a lot of growers who claimed to have been organically growing their marijuana all these years weren't doing it organically. They were using some very risky herbicides and pesticides. And unlike vegetables, you don't wash cannabis before you consume it. So people have been consuming this stuff directly into their lungs. So that's another benefit of legalization is you can actually regulate quality.
Now, it's interesting because when people hear legalization, they may think it's something blanket that covers everything. And you talked about some of these nuances in the law. So what do we know about how Canada designed its policies as well as its restrictions at this point?
Yeah, so under the federal system, the provinces have a lot of control over how they choose to do this. Some of them will try to use state liquor stores, for instance. Others will, Ontario still doesn't have a pot shop that's open, and it's the largest province, the most populous. But they do have online sales. So the Conservatives wanted, they didn't like the idea of state-controlled stores, so they wanted private shops, but then they haven't had time to develop those regulations. So it's a patchwork system throughout Canada. But one thing that is pretty much universal is that people will be able to purchase it through the mail, through the postal system. And quite coincidentally, I just read that the Canadian Postal Service may go on strike next week over labor concerns. So it's an interesting time to get people's attention about labor issues.
And certainly a lot of different aspects involved, obviously selling online, selling over the mail. What are some of the concerns about potential cross-border issues?
Well, we had this odd situation where a lot of the states that are next to Canada in the United States have legalized. So Washington State, Maine, Vermont, and also this November, Michigan and North Dakota will be voting on it, and I'm cautiously optimistic they will pass. And so we have this weird situation where it's legal on both sides, but it's illegal to transport through international lines, mostly because it's the U.S. federal government still views marijuana as completely illegal. So it doesn't recognize state laws, and they have jurisdiction.
So tell us about what this means for retailers. We have these banking lobbies in the U.S. trying to figure out how to bridge this gap between, obviously, it being a violation under federal law, meanwhile you have individual states legalizing certain aspects of it. How does all this work if you're a cannabis-related business?
It's a very tricky and dicey issue right now because only last week, U.S. Customs and Border Protection finally clarified some of their policies. Because previously, they had said that they were going to target anyone who invests in the legal marijuana business in the United States that is traded on the Canadian stock exchanges legally. They would give them a lifetime ban from ever entering the United States. Similarly, if you worked for the marijuana industry in a pot shop, even if you didn't use marijuana, you would still receive a lifetime ban from the United States. They've said they're not going to target those workers now. But there still are a lot of regulations on the books that they can enforce. So if a border officer asks you, have you ever used marijuana, and you answer honestly that you have, for instance, and it's 40% of Canadian adults, quite frankly, they are eligible to receive still a lifetime ban for admitting that they've used something that's the federal government says there's no valid use of.
So then what does this mean in terms of investment and growth for the industry, being that you do still have these restrictions, and where would you say that the bulk of the investment is going?
It's going to, I think, move a lot towards Canada because when you have the national legal market, but you also have the stock exchanges. And I think the U.S., there's a lot of concern from some members of Congress in legal states that they're going to miss out on this. And this potentially quite a lucrative market, and a lot of tax revenue is going to go to Canada rather than, say, the United States. So there are members of Congress who are trying to rectify this right now.
And any lessons that you think can be learned? Obviously, you have Canada, you have Uruguay. Any sort of lessons that can be learned from how they rolled out their legislation?
You know, I think the biggest lesson for me is what the Dutch learned decades ago. by making it no longer forbidden fruit, that you can go in, if you're an adult, you can go into a coffee shop in Holland and purchase tolerated amounts, small amounts of cannabis or hashish. They've turned it from forbidden fruit into something that's boring. Make marijuana boring, I think, is a good slogan, because they've driven down use amongst teenagers compared to the United States, which had historically very tough laws on cannabis. And so by making marijuana boring, it's actually achieving a lot of what the scare tactics couldn't achieve. Kids could take it or leave it, and they mostly choose to leave it.
Interesting slogan, make marijuana boring. Thank you so much. A lot of good insights there. Our thanks to Sanho Tree of the Institute for Policy Studies and Director of the Institute's Drug Policy Project.